At the end of this video, I will be ranking every JoJo I've read about and every JoJo OP I've listened to in one big tier list. But before I get into that, it's time to round off this series with the completion of Part 5, bringing me up to date with the official localization available to English speakers around the world. And this arc's ending surprised me, to put it simply, but I want to dive into that in more detail later. The overall story in this Part 5 had me laughing, singing, and on the edge of my seat throughout its duration. And today I'm going to break it down and give you my tier list for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But first, here are my final thoughts on a series I've grown to love and respect over the last 2 months with you all. I'm totally not Mark, and these are my first impressions of, thoughts on, and review for the fabled second half of JoJo's 5th part, Golden Wind. Okay, so as I said at the beginning, this one was a very strange experience, and I mean that in the good bizarre way that I've become accustomed to, but also in that other slightly more negative way. But generally speaking, 95% of this arc is my favorite bit of JoJo, and the other 5% is probably the most underwhelming piece of JoJo that I've ever seen, and just so happens that 5% occupies the last few episodes, but I'll get to that a little later, because most of this second half I absolutely adored, forcing me to take back all of my prior criticisms in the first half, while also continuing to deliver what made the first half of the story so infectious and engaging, delivering terrific fights left, right, and center. Bite your tongue, Narancia. This might very well be the most interesting and creative fight scene in the second half, meaning we are starting off strong with a Narancia fight, taking place right after Fugo pieces out literally never to be seen again for the rest of this story. I'm serious. We get a lead from Trish pointing the finger to Sardinia, where there may be a lead that points to the boss's true identity. There they encounter this amazing team of stand users, one that has a small fish that attacks people and another that has a small stand that forces the host to say the opposite of what they mean. It's such a fun and bizarre what-if scenario that I couldn't see being made into a reality in any other story. By far, this is the arc's strongest aspect, I think, with this one in particular forcing the hero team to work together as Giorno fashions a new tongue for Narancia to out the bad guys in the act. The very best fights in this arc, and really this series, come from when more than one person works together. Apart from this feeling narratively satisfying watching two friends battle together, this arc employs so much thought and creativity behind each outing's respective execution that I'd be surprised if Araki said this wasn't his favorite aspect of writing JoJo. And as for the bad guys, they all get brutally murdered. Fight on a plane. In addition to all of these terrific and thoughtful fights, this second half fulfills my one request in giving Trish something more to work with in terms of character, thanks to this fight on the plane wherein she develops and comes to grips with her very own stand. However, that visual and mechanical aspect to the story is not why I like it necessarily. Instead, I like it for what it does for Trish's character. Taking a closer look, it's important to recognize the choices different characters make in a story. This very aspect is key to helping the audience build a bond and for us to, well, like them. It makes us want them to succeed. For instance, The Lion King has a scene in the elephant graveyard where Simba saves Nala from the hyenas. This is key because up until this point, Simba has been a childish brat, but in that moment we realize that while he blusters a lot, he also stands behind what he says, helping us grow to like Simba as a character, and they cut it out of the live-action remake. Okay, Mark, chill. Wrong video, another time. After a flesh-eating parasite-type stand find its way onto the plane, it becomes a very real threat that forces Trish to either run, hide, or fight. Very early it's made obvious that she doesn't want anything to do with it, and it is in fact terrifying to her. However, what keeps her from staying put in hiding is her desire to prevent it from causing further harm to her team. In essence, she forces herself out of a more comfortable situation for the sake of others. In other words, she becomes a hero, and I love that. The boss. Oddly enough, my favorite aspect of this arc's second half comes from one of my larger criticisms within the first. Diavolo, the big boss man behind this nationwide criminal syndicate, having been established as being hell-bent on protecting his most prized possession, his true identity, one of Araki's biggest strengths is his fearless exploration into an idea and never doing anything by any half measures. Because of this philosophy, he created something in Diavolo I never anticipated or saw coming. The psychotic, unsettling, and creative depiction of a man with a split personality sharing the same body with a younger, more fragile personality, receiving calls and instructions from the boss through his own delusion, demonstrating to us through his backstory and his ultimate conflict with Risotto after his team had been almost completely taken out by Bruno's crew. Like Kira, there's a sprinkling of vulnerability to Diavolo's depiction, particularly during this section as he desperately gives direction to his younger subordinate in creepier and creepier ways. However, it should be noted that Diavolo, unlike Kira, strikes a much more imposing tone and, for the most part, poses a much more interesting threat to the crew. Rather than simply running, he pursues the crew, pitting him in nail-bitingly exciting scenarios as we watch him indirectly and directly figure out how to solve his situations respectively, with all of his established characteristics later paying off or making for some really interesting situations thanks to his unique character design, both physically and mentally speaking. Just about managing to escape this particular occasion with Risotto, though not without sustaining a considerable amount of damage, all the while another member of Bruno's team bites the dust, moments before he reveals what he looks like to the crew dying in the line of duty. He'll be missed. Green Day and Oasis. Again, this is another example of a team of villains whose stands complement each other. One creates mold on your body the lower you go, and the other turns the ground into mush. They complement each other, and the relationship is fine. Who am I to judge? It comes to Giorno's attention that Bruno isn't okay, that he keeps sustaining weird amounts of damage but not saying anything about how he got it. And as it turns out, he's actually sort of dead, and Giorno's gold experience back on the island off of Venice healed him enough to keep going a bit longer. In truth, he's dead, but not dead. And if that sounds confusing, then you know exactly as much as I do. After being contacted by a mysterious individual who claims to have answers, the team now need to get past these guys and meet this individual at the Colosseum in Rome, the perfect place to end our stint in Italy. Once again, the action is spectacular, with the stakes at times feeling enormous, with guest appearances even by Diavolo. And Giorno gets to do something which I am always a fan of. And what's more is, Bruno is a boss and takes out the weird muddy water swimming guy. Once we get to the Colosseum, however, we get to meet Polnareff, and he becomes a tortoise, which is cool. Okay, so there's a bit of explaining that involves some of the things in this finale that I'm not sure I liked, but let me say one last nice thing. When everyone swaps bodies, and yeah, okay, that happens, they swap bodies, that's how Polnareff ends up in the tortoise, I really liked that you could tell which personality was in which body just by looking at the posing of the respective characters. That was a really cool visual touch. And okay, it's time to discuss the ending now. The ending. Those among you that have taken the time to watch any of my other reviews will notice that when something impresses me, I tend to be more critical of it. That shouldn't be taken as any indication other than respect. When a story surprises me, I like to up my default standard to test where the merits of this story truly lie. For instance, I'm not going to heavily scrutinize over the idiosyncrasies of Phantom Blood's narrative because it's a simple story exercising quite well an established formula while adding in some interesting things here and there. And in the case of Stardust Crusaders, it's clear what Araki was going for, and when the ending came about, it fit that billing quite well. In other words, trying to get a read on what the arc is trying to do is key in determining for me if it's successful or not in its execution. But when it comes to stories like Golden Wind, I think there's enough going on under the surface to warrant holding the expertise of Araki to a higher standard, and keeping that in mind, because of this, I have to say that I thought the ending to Golden Wind, in addition to being disappointing on a narrative level personally, also felt confused, convenient, and felt as though it struggled to tie anything together, and as a result made other earlier choices in the story feel either tagged in or totally undelivered upon. But I want to make one thing clear. This isn't the same thing as a show delivering something good with it not being what I particularly liked, or being let down by comparison. I mean, I never would have expected part 4 to go the way that it went, and typically if stories stick the landing, I end up enjoying those stories a lot more, because they surprise me. So let's dive into my specific issues with Golden Wind's conclusion. It doesn't feel like it delivers upon the promise it makes at the beginning of the story. This might be a somewhat abstract concept to understand, but in truth, most every story promises something at the beginning in some shape or form. The promise is that whatever is said or shown will be important to the story moving forward in big or small ways. That everything we are being shown has meaning, that there's purpose behind it. However, this isn't, or at least didn't feel like the case when it comes to Golden Wind. Some of my favorite pieces of writing towards the beginning came from how Koichi and Jotaro became a part of the story and how they engaged with Giorno's life. But once they show up, they disappear, never to be seen from again. So I ask, what was the point of them even being there in the first place? Because it's tradition to have old characters take part? And what about Fugo? Why give that character so much development if he isn't going to add anything meaningful to the arc. These two things were in the back of my mind, knocking around all throughout the climax of the story. I was waiting for them. I liked Fugo. I liked the idea behind the motivation for Koichi in this story, but none of these were delivered upon, despite them contributing a large amount to the story. And this just left me wondering why they were there at all if they offered little to nothing for the second half of the story. The fight scenes during this section felt spectacular. They were well animated and visually stunning. I mean, Requiem Gold Experience looks awesome, but, and this is a big but for me, it's style over substance, and that substance is missing from the story. What makes great endings great in my book is in part visual spectacle, which can take many different forms, but it's also how the story manages to tie back into the beginning or an earlier part of the story to help grant a greater sense of occasion, gravity, or meaning to the conflict at hand. I like to think back to series like One Piece or even Dragon Ball. One Piece is filled to bursting with conclusions tying themselves back to the beginning or an earlier part of the arc to better inform its conclusion. Think of the Going Merry saving everyone from Enies lobby, or think the giant shadow and fight with Enel in Skypia, and think of the battle that Luffy had with Katakuri that was perfectly informed by the arc in question and Katakuri's relationship with his family. This tells us something about the world, it tells us something about why they're fighting, and it tells us something about the characters. None of this is random, and it makes the conclusion all the more satisfying because of it. It feels more real. Similarly, when it came to Gohan transforming during his fight with Cell, we knew and felt that this was a monumental moment because it, like everything else I've mentioned, was built up to, and when it happened, it did so with great occasion and fanfare, much to the delight of everyone watching. But when Requiem Gold Experience took out Diavolo, the boss of the massive criminal syndicate, I felt like I watched an ending that was put together by someone that hadn't read or known anything about the prior events of the story, because it didn't really tie anything together. Granted, I appreciate that the bow and arrow stuff has been part of the story since part 4, but the elements that this arrow contributes to the story have nothing to do with anything we've learned about it before other than what the arrow looks like. The concept of piercing your own stand isn't introduced until the third act of this arc, which is all in service of ending this arc the way Araki wanted to. But if he wanted to, why not make that aspect part of the beginning? The way Araki wanted to end this arc is by granting Gold Experience, not Giorno, Gold Experience, a power-up that gives the stand agency and a brand new ability that perfectly fits the situation to take out Diavolo. It has nothing to do with Giorno, nothing to do with what Giorno has learned or achieved throughout this journey feels as though it's contributed in any meaningful way towards this ending, and as a result, I feel like a new random character in Requiem Gold Experience just shows up with a brand new convenient power to save the day. This, more than anything, made the ending fall flat for me, causing me to wonder where the tension went and what was the point of this entire journey. For me, the best part of this particular story is everything that happened up until the point they meet Polnareff in the Colosseum, which was wonderful to see, and his transformation into the tortoise was fittingly hilarious too. However, unfortunately, this isn't where the ending concludes either. When Diavolo is defeated by not Giorno, but instead his stand, Gold Experience, we are shown something of a mini-arc that takes place over 2 episodes wherein we see a flashback, showing what Bruno and Mista did right before meeting Giorno in person towards the beginning of the story. This was one of the strangest decisions made narratively, in my opinion. Right as the climax hits, we are dragged back in time to the beginning of the story for what feels like an OVA with optional content, killing what little hype and expectation I had during the occasion in favor of showing me a story about fate told through a boulder with separation anxiety. All before cutting back to the main story where everyone just sort of says goodbye and good job to each other and walks off before once again cutting to the future with Giorno as a mob boss for a few seconds. What happened to the people of Naples he wanted to help? What happened to what Bruno wanted to achieve for his town? What happened to Giorno's goal? And are we meant to just accept that everything is fine and that he took care of it off screen? These are the motivating factors that caused us to get behind these characters in the first place. Showing what the character has achieved is part of the payoff. It's the goal of the entire story. This is like watching Ash Ketchum travel far and wide to become the Pokemon League champion only for the writers to cut that part out. This would be like watching Luffy have the heartfelt confrontation with Nami during Arlong Park only for them to cut out the gang fighting Arlong and flash to the aftermath for 3 or 4 seconds. Having spent months covering this story, one thing I've become accustomed to has been how these stories like to bask in the spoils of their win and the extravagant means with which they like to conclude the final fights. But moreover, I like how the main characters play a role in that finish. But Giorno really doesn't get to do much of anything other than to facilitate the existence of gold experiences change. I've spent a long time talking about these hang-ups I've had because I wanted to make perfectly clear that these issues I have are aspects of the story I've attempted to think through. I've no issue with this being someone's favorite ending, and I've been diligent in saying that these are just my own personal opinions, but by the time I reached the ending of the story, I was completely convinced that this wasn't so much an arc, but more so the story of how Giorno became who he is, or should I say, the story about how Giorno looked like he was the one who was going to achieve something, only for Gold Experience to actually be the one to do that instead. Maybe Gold Experience should be the mob boss now. In other words, this story didn't feel like it was in service of its own narrative, but instead it felt like it was in service of the next. And when it comes to the conclusion of a particular arc, I don't care about the next one. I care about what we've built up to here and now. And for me, Golden Wind didn't deliver anything that I wanted personally. Now, okay, that's a lot of negativity. With all of that said, however, 95% of this story is by far my favorite arc in the story, with characters that felt fun and relatable. I'm still a firm believer that Bruno, Mista, and Arantxa are the best characters in the story. Heck, the glow up Diavolo got in the second half made him one of the more interesting characters too. Which brings me to this moment. It's time for the tier list. Over the last 8 videos and 2 months, I have reviewed all 5 currently released and localized arcs of Hirohiko Araki's JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, an anthology of stories following primarily the bloodlines of the Joestars, and in the case of the most recent arc, Dio Brando. However, seeing as this will be my last review I make on JoJo until part 6 gets translated, I will, right here and now, present you all with my tier list for my favorite JoJos and my favorite JoJo OPs. Alright, so right off the bat, I'm gonna need to destroy everything from D tier and below. Everything on this list I at the very least enjoyed, particularly with the music. I even had all of these tracks playing while I worked on this video, and yes, I know all of the lyrics. C tier, Jonathan Joestar. So, working our way up, starting with the JoJo that initiated this whole journey, we have the OG himself, Jonathan Joestar. As the original JoJo, he sort of sets the standard, and to be frank, had you approached me before I began this review and told me I would end up liking Jonathan, I never would have believed you. While not being very interesting in terms of personality, I found his virtuous death both tragic and shocking, made all the more emotional in later installments, particularly in their OPs, but I'll get to that later. Next up, Traitor's Requiem. It's funny how the first JoJo and the last song from part 5 are opening up this list. Traitor's Requiem is a somewhat understated song and one that I truthfully almost forgot to include on this list. Maybe I'd rank it higher if it had more time to grow on me, however, as the second OP from Golden Wind, it'll have to stand alongside Jonathan as the bar set for this series. Chase. Coming in as a C-tier entrant is Chase from Diamond is Unbreakable. As the middle child of the 3 Diamond is Unbreakable OPs, it didn't really have much narratively to play with from a visual perspective, and musically I think this is probably one of the songs I listen to the least. With that said, I still know all of the lyrics and I do love it. B-tier, Giorno Giovanna. And with that, we arrive at the tier labeled B, and I get a sinking feeling people are going to be really upset that I've decided to place Giorno here. As you've seen in this and the last review covering the events of part 5, I am a massive fan of what it managed to achieve in captivating me, but also in demonstrating how much better Araki managed to get as a writer during his time working on JoJo. With all of that said, due to the ensemble nature of this story and the lack of screen time Giorno ultimately received, I didn't really have that much of a chance to form much of a bond with him as a character. There are plenty of instances throughout and during this story where I really enjoyed him as a character, however, it wasn't enough to give him an edge over the other JoJos on this tier list for me. Fighting Gold. On the other hand, I have no idea as to whether or not placing Fighting Gold on the B tier is a controversial take or not. Seeing this song here shouldn't be an indication of anything other than the quality and high standard all of the other tracks have set. But yeah, I really like this song, just not as much as I've come to expect from JoJo. It could have something to do with the chorus, but who knows. Bloody Stream. Like I said, I had no idea if the previous one was a controversial take. I do, however, know for a fact that this one will be controversial. Bloody Stream. I adore the song and I love how cool and smooth the lead singer's vocals are. I have no idea if this song's proximity to other tracks in the series played a role or whether or not its much more subdued arrangement when compared with the others played into its position here. I just never really connected with the song in the same intense way I did with all of the others that came after on this list. As B tier goes, I'd say this is the strongest contender for A tier, but not quite. I had to draw the line somewhere in the sand, and Bloody Stream just didn't make the cut for me personally. A tier. Crazy, noisy, bizarre town. I'm a massive fan of tracks that capture the essence and tone of their respective stories, and if I'm being perfectly honest, Crazy, Noisy, Bizarre Town sets the standard in that department. Catchy, upbeat, with fittingly bizarre visuals featured over the quaint little town the story is based within. This is perhaps more than any other an earworm I'll never shake, and you know what? I'm not even mad. Josuke Higashikata. Something I've noticed in my reading through of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is that the main characters seem to take more and more of a backseat role from Joeseph onwards, and while Josuke didn't get the Giorno treatment in that he had to totally share with all of the other side characters equally, I felt like I could have done with more screen time with Josuke. There really aren't too many scenes in that story where the audience gets to spend some one-on-one time with Josuke, and I think that probably played a role into my bonding with the character. I feel like Josuke deserves to be on the S tier, but for some reason I felt like after the arc finished there was still so much I wanted to know and learn about Josuke. I wanted more, which I suppose is a good thing if not for the fact that I expected more. Regardless, from what I did see, I saw a subtly emotional, lighthearted and relaxed JoJo that I thoroughly enjoyed from start to finish, and for a long time was in the running for my all-time favorite JoJo. Kujo Jotaro. Unlike Josuke, whom I liked from the outset, Jotaro was very much a character that took time to grow on me. Initially, my exposure to him via the anime many years ago created a feeling of boredom surrounding the character. However, through the manga, I sincerely thought a lot more subtle emotional cues shined through. That, coupled with some wonderfully timed straight-faced gags and some truly badass scenes with him, Jotaro climbs out of the expectations I had and into the extremely entertaining A tier. Great Days. Of all the tracks on this list, this is the one that surprised me the most by how much I love it. Capping off the last spot on A tier is Diamond is Unbreakable's OP Great Days. This track managed to reach this high spot despite me only knowing about it for the last few weeks, which I mean speaks volumes about how much I like and listen to this song. It's not as punchy as some of the other tracks in S tier, but as far as the softer JoJo tracks go, this one is my absolute favorite. Crazy Noisy Bizarre Town is awesome, but I'd sincerely think I enjoyed this one just that little bit more. And now the time you've all been waiting for. Time for the S tier. First up, Sonochi no Kyoku. Kicking things off and setting the standard from this point on is the last OP of Part 3, Sonochi no Kyoku. Unlike many of the other OPs, this one in particular feels as though it's mirroring the story. Starting ominously, it builds to an impactful moment following the visuals of the Stardust Crusaders making their way to Dio. And man, when they do eventually get to Dio, this OP features a revised Dio edit mirroring the story perfectly and giving further context to the original version. It's catchy, it's informed by the story, and while I was reading along, this track really got me hyped. Stand Proud. While I know a lot of people prefer Sonochi no Kyoku over Stand Proud, this track marked the instance that this series really and truly hooked me on a narrative level. Before hearing this track, I knew I loved the music and I knew I could really get into certain characters, but what this OP did for me was bring to the forefront of my mind that this story was more than just a third largely disconnected plot, but something that we've been building towards for years. With Jonathan's closing eyes, Joeseph as a young man turning around, and Jotaro standing and facing forward, in that split second of the OP, it reminded me that this arc will be the culmination of everything that came before it, and in a weird way was sort of nostalgic to me. And on top of that, this track also gave me a new appreciation for Jonathan Joestar and slaps so damn hard, which never hurts. Joeseph Joestar. Finally, here he is, my favorite JoJo, Joeseph Joestar. Standing proud and S tier, this character captures pretty much everything I like in a character. He's active, not too serious, intelligent, and with a hidden kindness that he doesn't like to flaunt all that often. Within my infamous watch through all those years ago that ended with me not liking the series at all, there were two things that I liked, and one of them was Joeseph Joestar. In addition to that, I think my love for him is aided by way of him being present and taking part in 3 separate arcs of JoJo, but for me, nothing will beat Battle Tendency Joeseph. He's snarky, he's brilliant, and he's hot as And now it's time to share with you all my favorite OP from JoJo. Sonochi no Sadame. This song is based. Long before I ever gave this series another shot, back in the days I was convinced I didn't like JoJo, I still had Sono Chino Sadame unabashedly blasting in the speakers of my car, with the windows open screaming the lyrics. And I'm not just talking about the OP, I'm talking about the full version too, wherein the singer, with every passing chorus, bellows a more emphatic and long JoJo than the last, with the final JoJo exclamation lasting 8 seconds. That's awesome, and for me, it's the series' best track by far. And that's my tier list. I have a list of my favorite JoJo parts too, but I'll be posting them to my Twitter instead. If you want to see that list, check me out at Totally Not Mark. While this definitely won't be the last video I'll review in the JoJo story, it is the last review I'll write for quite a while. At least until the next arc gets officially translated. I think it's such an amazing thing getting to experience these stories alongside the fans that adore it, and for that I am truly grateful and appreciative for the position that I'm in, and for the support that you've all given me. I'd like to also extend a special thank you to Anime AJ for filling in as a guest editor for this series. I think he did an amazing job, and I can't wait to work with him in the future on other projects. However, next week it's back to business as usual for the month of March, with some Dragon Ball and maybe some One Piece content. However, during the month of April, I begin a new series in Hunter x Hunter. I've been waiting to start this story for ages, and I've been hearing so much about it. But until then, I've been Totally Not Mark. Thank you all once again so much for the support you've shown over the last 2 months, and I can't wait to see you all on the next adventure.